My dad refuses to wear a mask. He can manage leaving it drooping under his nose when he sees a sign outside a store, but he's unwilling under any circumstances to let it cover his face. Naturally, he'll never get vaccinated either, so to stay in line with state mandates, the family therapist he had agreed to meet at my request needed to get creative. I made the hour-and-a-half drive back to my hometown to pick my dad up on a fall afternoon, and for the first time in nearly a year, we spoke together on our way to the park where the therapist was waiting. Once there, she led us to a pair of wooden benches, far enough from the paved path to keep us from being overheard, but still able to see grad students jogging with their dogs and retirees taking an afternoon walk. This was family therapy in the time of COVID. A few sandwiches short of a picnic, confronting the culmination of my father's 20-year career as an influential conspiracy theorist. My dad's life story is a diorama of the boomer experience. He grew up in California's 50s and 60s, the son of an abusive father with no ideology of his own until he decided to prove himself by joining the army during the Vietnam War. Between basic training and receiving his first deployment, he befriended a hippie college student who first flipped the switch on his political awareness as an anti-war liberal. So he went AWOL, running away to Canada, and on the way meeting a young woman who was herself on the road with a carny from her home in the Midwest. Leaving the military and the carny boyfriend behind, the two settled north of the border for a while, before coming back to his wife's home state as a married couple. Back then, he was a skinny, bearded vagabond and fiddle player, but after having his daughter and divorcing his first wife, he wanted to get an education. He picked what looked like an interesting bachelor's degree, sociology, at the local state university where he became a kind of intellectual liberal and married his second wife. By January 6, 1991, the day I was born, he was dabbling in the stock market, and by the late 90s he was again divorced but had ridden the dot-com bubble with the rest of Wall Street. He made big plans and embraced this new spirit of economic conservatism, but both would be crushed by the bubble's burst. This is the dad that I grew up with, filled with hunger for knowledge, love for his children, anger at injustice, and bitter cynicism for the world. But it was the September 11th attacks that turned his curiosity and cynicism into a new mindset. In place of the Bush administration's messaging, cable news, and legacy media, he found the underground ecosystem of conspiracy theory websites, and he decided to join them. To my dad, and thousands of others who followed him into 9/11 conspiracies, the point of their theorizing was truth, even calling themselves 9/11 truthers. And when my dad created his own website, he became a prominent member of the movement. By his own estimates, he was getting over 1 million page views per year at one of his website's peaks, with at least tens of thousands of unique visitors. I believed him, but I couldn't fathom it, because I didn't yet understand his notion of truth. For years, my dad's career as a conspiracy theorist stayed on the leftist side of online conspiracism. But things started to change with Trump's presidential campaign. When Trump led the charge on Obama's birth certificate, my dad followed him into the breach. And when Trump announced in 2015 that he was running for president, my dad paid attention, considered his merits, and revealed to me everything he had begun to believe in preparation for that moment. He told me, "I'm a white nationalist, and that's why I'm voting for Trump." He said that his latest research had put it together. The leaders of the Western world had conspired to invade Iraq and then withdraw prematurely, creating the instability that would spark the Syrian civil war and the emergence of ISIS, which would in turn create a refugee crisis as millions fled the Middle East for Europe, Canada, and the United States, thus fulfilling the ultimate goal of the global elites, to force ethnic diversity and multiculturalism on the inherently white nations of Europe and North America. For more than a decade, I had seen my dad as a small but real force in the currents of American conspiracism, spinning theories that he discussed with prominent personalities in the conspiracist world and spread on his website. But he had never adapted his online conspiracy theorizing or himself, frankly, for the social media era. The power of the MAGA movement was sweeping him into a new current, and at that point he seemed only one step short of the black hole into which all conspiracism spirals down: the fearing and hating of Jewish people. That question snapped to the front lines the evening after the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. The boldly hateful violence carried out in the name of my dad's adopted movement was something dark and new. Something I needed him to answer for. So while driving home that evening, I pulled into an empty parking lot to call him. There was no hello, we both knew what this was about, and he immediately and unknowingly predicted Trump's line the day before he spoke it at a press conference. "I'm against violence on both sides," he said, except that my dad's side, the Klan and Nazi icon-wielding side, had murdered an anti-racist protester and injured over a dozen others. The only two sides that day were between terror and solidarity, but my dad couldn't understand it because he had embraced a mindset of authoritarian certainty. While I was back home from college one summer, my dad unloaded a fresh case for one of the new conspiracies he was getting into, the only one I ever got him to back down on. This time, he was trying to prove to me that Barack Obama's birth certificate was fake. We went at it, cordially but firmly, for hours, and by the end of the evening he conceded, saying, "Okay, maybe the birth certificate is real, but that doesn't mean that Obama isn't a puppet of the international banks that are trying to take over the country." Years later, his website would say that the raging COVID pandemic was at the same time a non-existent hoax, a bug no more dangerous than the flu, and a deadly Chinese biowarfare attack only treatable with risky, unproven drugs. It didn't matter to him that these things can't be true at the same time, in the same way that it didn't matter whether or not Obama's birth certificate was a fake. What mattered is that all these statements point to the same higher-order beliefs, that global finance is manipulating our leaders, or international elites and big pharma are conspiring to control our lives. Those were his greater truths. Everyone believes in capital T greater truths that reconcile aspects of the world and ourselves that seem to contradict. But where these truths are usually about things like love, family, art, or the divine, deep metaphysical truths, conspiracism begins with forcing greater truth into giving people authoritarian certainty about the empirical, factual world. Even when disproven on a point of fact, that point of fact will never really be what the conspiracist believed. What they always believed is a greater truth beyond the point of fact, and all they'll do is move the goalposts back further up the hill they plan to die on. This is how authoritarian certainty is the mechanism of Orwell's doublethink. Those who doublethink don't actually believe in two opposite things at the same time. They believe in a single greater truth that's more true to them than facts. So much so that a lie told to spread that truth is more true than any fact can be alone. Even a lie that contradicts other lies told for the same truth. They can always be reconciled by baptism within that greater truth, a certainty so powerful that it can dispel all doubt and assert itself as a dictator over our terrifyingly uncertain knowledge of the factual world. In other words, it's a capital letter big lie. Where a regular lie says what is false is fact to manipulate those who act on facts, a big lie strides out of the metaphysical, imposing greater truth over facts, crushing them underfoot to manipulate those who fear uncertainty. I ended the call with my dad the evening of the Unite the Right rally saying, "I just need you to tell me that you're not a Nazi and that you're against Nazis." He responded, "I'm not a Nazi. I'm against what they did today." "Okay, I love you," I said. "I love you too," he said, a little surprised. I hung up and drove home. Through the rest of the Trump presidency, we managed to keep on the same track we had for years, mostly ignoring his booming conspiracy theorist career, broaching the subject just enough to push it to the edge, and then backing off to talk about our personal lives again. The dam didn't begin to break until the week surrounding the 2020 election, in this case on account of me. I was getting more anxious as Trump kept saying that he wouldn't accept the election results if he lost, and publicly hinted to far-right militia groups that he had their backs. Where in 2016, Trump felt like a darkly bizarre longshot until he wasn't a longshot, in 2020, he felt like an existential threat to democracy, and my dad a promoter of his cynical paranoia with a web presence bigger than he had ever had before. Just before the election, I sent my dad an email explaining my fears about what he was becoming and what he was helping to bring on America. I called him out on what I knew of his anti-Semitic history-perverting conspiracizing, his conception of America as a nation by and for whites. I tried to appeal to the things that I believed he still believed. That stagnant wages and wealth consolidation were squeezing out the middle class, that racial and sexual minorities needed their rights and opportunities protected, that a better future depended on solidarity. Though my email was long, written between 2 and 4 a.m. in a weeknight haze, his response was short. He agreed with me, he said, that we should have a more fair tax code, universal health insurance, equal education funding, and every other issue I touched on. But he didn't want the Democrats to do it, because they would use it to gain more power and let the secret international communist forces take over the country. 9 weeks later, January 6th, 2021, began with a texted birthday wish from my mother-in-law, before being derailed by live coverage of the Capitol insurrection. And it ended with an email from my dad. "Are you still talking to me?" he asked. At that point, we hadn't talked in real time since the election, and we wouldn't again for almost a year. 3 years before, I had demanded that he answer for violence committed in the name of his new beliefs. But this time, I couldn't bring myself to listen to him explain. It was almost certain that at least one of the people who invaded the Capitol was one of the hundreds of thousands who exposed themselves to my dad's website. So I finally needed to know what he had told these people to make them inflict this violence against America. On the night I turned 30, while the Capitol Police and staff were cleaning broken glass and blood from the halls of Congress, I saw for myself what my dad had spent the last 2 decades creating. His ultimate weapon against the global conspiracy. Most of it is pulled together from other conspiracy sites, making it a kind of link hub, with enough text to fill multiple enormous volumes. But it's meant to create a unified theory for every controversial era and tragedy of recent history. The Jews did it. It's vile, mixing 20th century fascist philosophers with every deluded attempt to expose the steal and the plandemic. But these new conspiracies share front page space with its organized archives, the largest one being dedicated to Holocaust denial. Like all deniers do, it throws out decades of historical evidence of every kind to say, the idea that the Nazis committed systematic mass murder is nothing but a Zionist lie, used to exact revenge for the rightful persecution of the Jews and gain control over Western civilization. In my dad's own words as a Trump voter, the rise of Trump's MAGA movement is a new incarnation of the rise of the Nazis and the Weimar Republic, and that this is a good thing, he said, because this time the fascists are ready to finally defeat the Jews. His pseudo-intellectual anxiety about a more diverse America had turned into hate. My own dad had made an ally out of the most terrible evil in history and the worst people in the world, living and dead, absolving them of genocidal murder with fact-transcendent truth to stop an imaginary American communist revolution that would do the very things that he wants America to do. His greater truth, his big lie, that the Jews did it, filled eternity with the Wilzermacht of American white identity and turned a million words of easily disproved bile into a fortress of authoritarian certainty. I didn't call him, he didn't call me. Around the time I left my job in the publishing industry to go freelance, before the election and pandemic, I did a developmental read-through on the manuscript of The Brainwashing of My Dad by Jen Senko. Before reading her story, I had unconsciously known that there must be plenty of people out there with experiences like mine. Maybe not with dads who were coordinating virtual conspiracy conferences with internationally known headliners, but others who felt a lostness as their parents drifted away into a world of far-right paranoia and lies. While doing research for the book's development, I found Luke O'Neill's article, "I Hate What They've Done to Almost Everyone in My Family," on his Welcome to Hell World blog. The stories there were of family members who suffered the same fate as Senko's dad, being sucked into far-right rage and fear. These people were orphans, their parents taken from them by Fox News and conservative talk radio. But it was gentle compared to what I then found on QAnonCasualties. Like those who shared their loss with O'Neill, QAnonCasualties is a community of those suffering the years-long soul death of the most important people in their lives. I don't know how many of their stories I've read at this point. No matter how many I read, the next one never feels any less painful, but the time I spent hopefully gave me useful insight into the patterns of the lost. Many of those who have been lost to conspiracism, Qs as the forum users call them, are reflections of my dad, baby boomers who followed their children and grandchildren into a rapidly transforming future world that frightens them. They want explanations for why everything is changing in ways they don't understand, and they've found them in an online world ready to exploit their anxiety. But just as many seem to be my age, in their 30s, and so many of them are the ones who suffered the traumatic loss of their future to the pandemic. No longer being able to imagine or plan for a better tomorrow, they've become stuck in an eternal present of clicking on the next piece of engagement that the social media algorithms feed them. The AI does its job, promoting every fever dream logic explanation of who's to blame for their despair, while selling their increasingly addicted attention to the highest bidding ad. In an interview with author and journalist Masha Gessen, Dr. John Brinkman from the City University of New York offered a useful paraphrase of Gessen's misgivings about conspiracy thinking. It means you need an answer before you have the answer. And I think that's where the fall into conspiracism begins, with a compulsive emotional need, which is something that, for at least the past several years, social psychologists have thought is a driving force behind conspiracism. It works like this. A struggling average American asks of mainstream news, science, scholarship, and all our other systems of rational inquiry, what's happening in the world? What's going to happen? And rational inquiry explains that it's complicated. There are knowns and unknowns, potential solutions with benefits and trade-offs, and compromises we'll need to make with each other and with reality, but there's no way we can know everything about the present or future, least of all for you specifically. With these answers, rational inquiry has failed to understand. What it said was factually true, inescapably true, but the average American wasn't looking for a factual response hedging against uncertainty. My dad didn't actually believe that Obama's birth certificate was fake, not in the way that rational inquiry would. What they wanted was the certainty of a greater truth that would answer their fears. And when rational inquiry responded with facts alone, authoritarian certainty released greater truth from the confines of the metaphysical, imposing greater truth upon the factual world on behalf of those who fear it. For most Americans who make up this wave of conspiracism's power, the need is probably for security and stability and connection. They're struggling under the weight of a system that has kept wages suppressed, increasing the pressure on housing and healthcare and education expenses, while growing and protecting the fortunes of the richest men to ever live. The predictions of climate science are threatening their future unless we make unprecedented changes to the way our economy works. And new social media technologies, the loss of local news, and a general loss of collective purpose have left them feeling separated and adrift. For the rich and powerful, their uncertainty probably comes from a need to be special, to have special knowledge and insight, and to be confident that they should have the wealth and power that they have. This obviously includes conspiracist personalities who benefit from social media algorithms, but it also includes people in business and government who tolerate and spread conspiracies. When these people spout falsehoods in service of a greater truth they believe, regardless of the facts they ignore out of delusion, it might not meet the technocratic definition of a lie, but it is a big lie. As for my dad, I spent nearly a year after the insurrection stewing with every thought our 20-year saga could drudge up. I blamed him for people's deaths. The deaths at the Capitol, yes, and the preventable, lonely, goodbye-less deaths from COVID. But also the terrified, violent deaths of innocents at the hands of ethno-fascist terrorists armed with guns and knives and frothing delirious hatred at their own failure and insecurity and the people they wanted to blame. I could hold that against him forever, making him my enemy in a moral civil war. But I decided that ending our relationship there, with both me and my sister never talking to him again, would do no good for anyone. He had a past self who wasn't this person, and someone needed to try to bring that self back, if only so that he wouldn't spend the rest of his life alone, stewing in pointless delusional hatred. So, 9 months after I turned 30, I sent him an email asking if he would be willing to meet with someone who could help us. He said yes. The meeting opened with my dad guessing at the need to explain his side of how we had ended up there, starting with his abusive father and ending with the covert communist revolution on his website. It almost became a therapy session for him, as his life story gave us a window into past traumas, disappointments, and resolutions. He said he understood that it wasn't much good to argue politics, as he called it, with me, at least past a certain point. To him, that wasn't why we were meeting that day. He was the one who, when it came to our father-son relationship, wanted to push all the conspiracism to the side. I agreed that I wasn't there to argue about his conspiracy theories. That wouldn't do any good. But I wasn't going to ignore them. Instead of debating points of fact like we had for 20 years, I was there to talk about truth. I told him that I had been raised by a dad who believed in individual human dignity and equality, but I felt that he had betrayed those values with what he had spread to people through the course of his career. Regardless of conspiracism or politics or anything else, I wanted to make a moral and emotional appeal to who I believed he wanted to be, because I believed he wanted to be the dad he had always been to me. And you know what? We got somewhere. I don't know whether it's what he always believed but had lost the ability to say thanks to submersion in the far-right web, or if he returned to himself in that conversation, but he agreed. There's no essential difference between white and black and brown Americans. Race is a superficial feature and social construct with no bearing on how capable or good a person is. The fact that Black, Latin, and other non-white Americans tend to achieve less in education and career is because of legacies of segregation that limit the opportunities of those who are already poor and tend to keep Black and Latin Americans among the poor. What he said after that was maybe the biggest shock. He figured that another moral problem I had with him was his anti-Semitism, but on that point he was having a change of heart. Some Democrats, whom he believes are in thrall with the international Jewish conspiracy, were beginning to speak out against Israel's oppression of Palestinians, and Benjamin Netanyahu was removed as Prime Minister of Israel. He concluded this meant there must be a spectrum of Jewish identity where a significant number believe in justice. A small step, very small, but a real one, all because congressional Democrats and the Israeli people began to speak truth to power. Of all the scenarios I imagined when I asked my dad to meet after almost a year of silence, this was probably the best one that I had hoped for. He even explained that, thanks to Google's algorithms working against disinformation, his website traffic had been crushed. Lawsuits against his main high-profile conspiracist collaborator had suffocated his few remaining connections with the conspiracy world. He was feeling ready to abandon it as a career, maybe replacing his website with something geared toward his other interests. A derelict website filled with things that pushed us apart wouldn't be worth maintaining, not when there are other truths that could matter more. I've always had in my dad what most people who post their story on QAnonCasualties would dream of. Their own Q who loves them, who wants to listen to them, who wants to understand why they don't share their beliefs. Even with all of that, I have never been able to debate my dad out of his conspiracism. After that meeting, I believe more than ever that debating facts will never change any conspiracist's mind, because I may have gotten a glimpse at what might. For my dad, who I believe has an emotional need for a powerful enemy to fight against, it's true, with a capital T, that communists are orchestrating events to take over the Western world and impose a global totalitarian state. But it's also true to him, in one way or another, that all people are equal in dignity and moral worth. The former truth conquers reality to fulfill his emotional need for an enemy. The latter truth reconciles humanity and fulfills his emotional need to contribute to making the world a more just place. These are the reconciling truths I think we need to tell ourselves, my dad, and others about America. That this is meant to be a nation where those who are bright and driven have equal opportunity to succeed with great rewards. Where those of us who don't or can't succeed still live with dignity, without fear of destitution, able to have families and participate in communities and keep trying at success. Where we have a shared responsibility to raise and accept from abroad new generations of individuals who believe in a better future together, and where we have true freedom, Not a child's idea of the freedom to do whatever we want without consequences, but the real freedom to devote ourselves to the people, places, ambitions, and ideas we choose. I am certain that most of us believe these reconciling truths. By contributing the monumental effort it'll take, we can even make those truths more factually true as well. But too large a minority of us are still surrendering our uncertain factual world to authoritarian certainty. There just isn't enough of us ready to break out of that cage, not quite yet. The only way to get there is for those of us who believe in reconciling truths to be courageous in love and patience and generosity for those in our lives who cling to authoritarian certainty, believing in the best in them to help them understand what's really true about themselves and America. We need to always be inviting them into our separate polis where the future isn't known because it can never be known, but we're still confident that rational inquiry, hope, and solidarity can make the future better. Is that foolishly idealistic? Is this all kind of sappy? Maybe. No more than democracy itself. It's just what makes progress toward more and better democracy almost impossibly difficult, but still always possible. It's not fair, though, not at all, when so many conspiracists would never ask the same of themselves and would continue to use conspiracism as fuel for hatred. But none of this is about what anyone deserves. It's just the only way that a diverse democracy can work. To ridicule these people, exclude them, or deny them any avenue of coming to new understanding or reconciliation will only ever prove to them that what they believe is true as their emotional need deepens. If you have no interest in their need and only want to prove yourself right, you'll never persuade them that what they believe isn't true. And if you're not interested in persuasion, democracy is lost. It may be especially unfair that this has to be asked of you personally. The plague of conspiracism has done so much to hurt us all, and me far less than others, while you may have been hurt directly, painfully, and irreversibly. But this isn't love without power, sentimental and anemic. It doesn't mean that those who commit crimes or threaten violence or use their influence to spread big lies shouldn't be held accountable and publicly challenged with reconciling truth and its demonstration. It doesn't mean that those who abandon our mutual responsibility to defeat the virus should be left to do so at the expense of hundreds of thousands of lives. And it doesn't mean that someone in your life who threatens your mental or physical well-being has a right to keep a place in your life. But it does mean that those people can't be your enemies. You will never be able to destroy them, and if you try, you will follow them down the rabbit hole to the big lie that festers at the heart of all conspiracism. We are innocent, they are evil. It isn't easy for anyone, and even if you choose to extend love, patience, and generosity, there's no guarantee it will work. It won't even work for most. For every story like mine that may shed a bit of hope, there are a dozen more grievers on QAnonCasualties who invited their spouses to counseling, hoping they could bring back the person they fell in love with, but they still arrived at a bitter divorce. To the people who loved as patiently and generously as they could, but still suffered the end of a relationship, I'm sorry for your loss. But I hope you can feel that your loss is a sacrifice in a war for America's soul. The victory of reconciling truths that help make a better future isn't inevitable, and victory will never be forever. There will always be those of us who want authoritarian certainty to rule over our entire world, and it'll be a constant battle inside and out to resist it. But because you and many others tried, some of you succeeded, and more of you will succeed even if it's only a few. In the end, all we need is enough of us to save all of us.